Captain Bob Mitchell looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a 58-year-old commercial airline pilot nearing retirement with graying hair, reading glasses, and the kind of calm demeanor that reassured nervous passengers. He said, "Please," and "thank you" to the flight attendants, made gentle announcements about weather conditions, and always landed so smoothly that people barely felt the wheels touch down. But what his passengers and crew didn't know was that Colonel Robert Mitchell, retired U.S. Air Force, had spent 22 years in cockpits where being hijacked meant something very different than following civilian hostage protocols. Welcome to Faces Behind Stories. Before we begin this high-altitude story of hidden identity and deadly determination, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Midwest Airlines Flight 847 was scheduled to depart Chicago O'Hare at 2:15 p.m. bound for Denver International Airport. It was the kind of routine domestic route that Captain Robert Mitchell had flown hundreds of times over his 15 years with the airline. 2 hours of peaceful flying over farmland and prairie with nothing more challenging than occasional turbulence over the Rockies. Bob had chosen commercial aviation specifically because it was the opposite of his previous career. No combat missions, no hostile territory, no split-second life-and-death decisions. Just scheduled flights, predictable routes, and passengers who wanted to get from point A to point B safely. At 58, Bob looked every inch the experienced airline captain. His graying hair was neatly trimmed, his uniform pressed to perfection, and his manner with passengers and crew was unfailingly polite. He wore reading glasses for paperwork, carried himself with quiet confidence, and had the kind of reassuring presence that made nervous flyers feel safe. The passengers boarding Flight 847 saw exactly what Bob wanted them to see: a competent, experienced pilot who would get them to their destination without drama. What they didn't know was that Captain Bob Mitchell had once been Colonel Robert Mitchell, United States Air Force, with over 3,000 hours of combat flight time in F-16 Fighting Falcons. Bob had left the Air Force 15 years ago because he'd grown tired of war, tired of violence, tired of making life-and-death decisions at 500 miles per hour. He'd wanted to use his flying skills for something peaceful. Commercial aviation had given him exactly what he'd sought: the joy of flying without the burden of combat. Flight 847 was carrying 127 passengers and a crew of 6. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon load: business travelers, families heading to Colorado, elderly couples visiting grandchildren, college students with backpacks. Among the passengers were 3 men who'd boarded separately but taken seats in a triangle formation throughout the cabin. They appeared ordinary. One in a business suit, another in casual clothes, the third dressed like a college student. They'd passed through security without incident. But these 3 men were members of an international terrorist cell that had spent months planning this operation. They'd chosen Flight 847 because it was a domestic route with relaxed security, an older aircraft that would be easier to control, and a flight path over major population centers. Their plan was simple: take control shortly after reaching cruising altitude, use improvised weapons smuggled past security, and force the pilots to change course to a target of their choosing. What their research hadn't revealed was the true background of the man in the left seat. They'd seen exactly what Bob had wanted everyone to see for 15 years: a quiet, professional airline pilot with no background that would complicate their plans. At 3:47 p.m., as Flight 847 cruised peacefully at 35,000 feet over the Kansas prairie, the 3 men made their move. It happened quickly, coordinated with military precision that spoke of extensive planning and training. The man in the business suit, seated in 12A, stood up during beverage service and produced what appeared to be a knife fashioned from plastic components that had passed through security screening. The second man, in casual clothes in seat 14C, revealed a similar improvised weapon while moving toward the front of the cabin. The third, the college student in 16F, blocked the aisle leading to the rear of the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen," the first man announced in accented English, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "this aircraft is now under our control. Everyone remain in your seats with your hands visible. Do not use cell phones or electronic devices. Any resistance will result in casualties." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Some passengers screamed, others began crying, children started asking their parents what was happening. A few business travelers instinctively reached for their phones before thinking better of it. The flight attendants, trained for exactly this scenario, began following their hijacking protocols. Comply with hijacker demands, keep passengers calm, avoid confrontation. In the cockpit, Bob heard the commotion through the cabin door and immediately understood what was happening. His first reaction was to reach for the radio to alert air traffic control, but before he could transmit, the cabin door opened and the man in the business suit entered the cockpit, his improvised weapon clearly visible. "Captain," the hijacker said with cold professionalism, "you will follow my instructions exactly. First, turn off the transponder and disconnect all communication equipment. Then, you will change course to the heading I give you. Any attempt to signal ground control or deviate from my orders will result in the death of passengers." Bob's hands moved slowly toward the controls, his mind already shifting into a mode he hadn't used in 15 years. The hijacker was clearly experienced. His positioning in the cockpit showed tactical awareness, and his calm demeanor suggested this wasn't his first operation. But the hijacker had made one critical error in his planning. He'd assumed that Captain Bob Mitchell would react like a civilian pilot, with compliance, fear, and adherence to standard hijacking protocols that prioritized passenger safety above all else. He had no idea that Colonel Robert Mitchell had been trained for aerial combat situations where compliance meant death, where the mission came before personal safety, and where a hijacked aircraft was a weapon that had to be stopped at any cost. Bob kept his hands visible and his voice calm as he responded to the hijacker's demands. "I understand your instructions," he said in the same reassuring tone he used for routine announcements. "I'll need to access different control panels to shut down the communications equipment." The hijacker nodded, maintaining his position where he could watch both pilots while keeping his weapon ready. He was confident, professional, clearly following a well-rehearsed plan. What he didn't notice was the way Bob's eyes were scanning the cockpit instruments, not looking for communication controls, but assessing aircraft status, fuel load, altitude, and airspeed. Military habits ingrained through thousands of hours of combat flying. Bob was gathering intelligence, analyzing the tactical situation, formulating options with systematic precision that fighter pilots developed through years of training. As Bob reached for the transponder controls, he was calculating something the hijacker couldn't have anticipated. In his 22 years as an Air Force pilot, Bob had dealt with scenarios where his aircraft had been targeted by hostile forces. He'd trained for situations where enemy fighters tried to force him to change course. The hijacker saw a compliant airline pilot following orders to avoid passenger casualties. Bob saw a hostile force that had taken control of his aircraft and was planning to use it as a weapon against innocent people on the ground. "Communications are now offline," Bob reported, having actually activated a discrete emergency transponder code that would alert air traffic control to the hijacking without the hijacker's knowledge. "What heading would you like me to take?" The hijacker consulted a small piece of paper. "Turn to heading 095 and descend at 25,000 feet. Maintain that course and altitude until I give you further instructions." Bob's military mind immediately recognized what that heading meant. 095 degrees would take them directly toward Chicago, over some of the most densely populated areas in the Midwest. At 25,000 feet, they'd be at the optimal altitude for maximum destruction if the aircraft was used as a weapon against a ground target. This wasn't a traditional hijacking for ransom or political demands. This was a suicide mission designed to turn Flight 847 into a guided missile. "Beginning turn to 095, Bob acknowledged, his hands moving to the flight controls while his mind shifted fully into combat mode. The transformation wasn't visible to the hijacker, but it was complete. Captain Bob Mitchell, airline pilot, had been replaced by Colonel Robert Mitchell, fighter pilot, and the rules of engagement had just changed fundamentally. Co-pilot Sarah Chen, sitting in the right seat, noticed the change immediately. Something in Bob's posture, his movement, his voice had shifted. She'd flown with him for 3 years and had never seen him like this, still calm, still professional, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Sarah," Bob said quietly, "I need you to monitor our position and be ready to take emergency action on my command. We may need to deviate from the hijacker's instructions. The hijacker, focused on watching for any signs of resistance or communication attempts, didn't catch the subtle change in the cockpit dynamics. He saw two compliant airline pilots following his orders. He didn't see a combat veteran preparing to retake control of his aircraft. As Flight 847 turned toward Chicago and began its descent, Bob was working through a plan that combined military training with commercial aviation experience. The challenge was neutralizing the hijackers without endangering passengers, while preventing the aircraft from being used as a weapon. Bob had one significant advantage the hijackers couldn't have anticipated. Military pilots train for scenarios where aircraft become uncontrollable, where they must make immediate decisions under extreme stress. Commercial pilots train for safety. Military pilots train for war. "I need to adjust our descent rate," Bob said to the hijacker. "The aircraft isn't responding normally to the altitude change." It was a lie, but plausible to someone who didn't understand aircraft operation. The hijacker watched as Bob's hands moved across the control panel. What the hijacker didn't see was Bob discreetly disabling the cabin pressurization system and setting up what military pilots called a rapid decompression scenario. In combat, it was a defensive measure used when aircraft were damaged by enemy fire. In this situation, it was about to become a weapon. "Sarah," Bob said quietly, "emergency oxygen masks, 30 seconds. Sarah understood immediately and began preparing the emergency oxygen system. In 30 seconds, every passenger would have emergency oxygen. The hijackers would be caught unprepared when cabin pressure suddenly dropped. What happened next took place in less than 60 seconds, but it changed everything about Flight 847. Bob initiated rapid decompression by releasing cabin pressure through the aircraft's emergency systems. The immediate effect was oxygen masks dropping throughout the cabin, confused passengers reaching for life support, and 3 hijackers suddenly struggling to breathe at 25,000 feet. The hijacker in the cockpit, caught completely off guard by the sudden loss of cabin pressure, struggled to maintain his position while gasping for air that was no longer there. His improvised weapon became secondary to his immediate need for oxygen. That moment of confusion was exactly what Bob had been waiting for. The man who moved across the cockpit wasn't an airline pilot anymore. Colonel Robert Mitchell disarmed the hijacker with a combination of speed, precision, and controlled violence that came from years of combat training. The hijacker was unconscious and secured within seconds, his weapon confiscated, and his threat neutralized. "Sarah, take control of pressurization," Bob commanded. "Restore cabin pressure immediately. I'm going to deal with the cabin." What the remaining 2 hijackers in the passenger compartment saw when the cockpit door opened was not the compliant airline captain they'd expected. Bob Mitchell stepped into the cabin with the bearing and presence of someone who'd spent decades making life-and-death decisions under pressure. The hijackers, still struggling with the effects of rapid decompression and confused by the sudden deployment of oxygen masks, found themselves facing someone who moved with military precision and complete tactical awareness. The engagement was brief, professional, and decisive. Within minutes, all 3 hijackers were secured, their weapons confiscated, and the threat to Flight 847 eliminated. As cabin pressure was restored and passengers removed their oxygen masks, Bob returned to the cockpit and took control of the aircraft. His first action was to restore communication with air traffic control and report the successful resolution of the hijacking. "Denver Center, this is Midwest 847 Heavy. Hijacking situation resolved. 3 suspects in custody, no casualties, returning to normal flight operations. Request priority landing clearance at Denver International." The response from air traffic control was immediate relief and professional efficiency. Within minutes, Flight 847 was being vectored toward Denver with priority handling, emergency vehicles standing by, and FBI agents preparing to take custody of the hijackers. In the cabin, passengers were slowly realizing what had happened. The rapid decompression had been frightening and confusing, but they were alive and safe. The hijackers were secured and no longer a threat, and their pilot had somehow managed to regain control of the aircraft without anyone being seriously injured. Flight attendant Rebecca Martinez, who'd been flying for 12 years, approached the cockpit after ensuring all passengers were stable. "Captain Mitchell," she said, I've never seen anything like what you just did. How did you know how to handle that situation?" Bob looked up from his instruments with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the flight. "Just training," he said with a slight smile. "Different kind of training than most airline pilots receive." Flight 847 landed at Denver International Airport 47 minutes behind schedule. As passengers deplaned, many stopped to thank Bob personally. Several asked about his background, curious about how an airline pilot had managed to handle armed hijackers so effectively. Bob's responses were polite but brief. "Just glad everyone's safe," he said repeatedly. "That's what we're here for." The FBI debriefing that followed revealed the scope of what Bob had prevented. The 3 hijackers were members of an international terrorist cell planning to crash Flight 847 into a major target in Chicago. Their plan had been meticulously researched and would have resulted in hundreds of casualties on the ground in addition to everyone aboard the aircraft. Agent Sarah Williams, lead investigator on the case, reviewed Bob's actions with professional admiration. "Captain Mitchell, what you accomplished was remarkable. The rapid decompression technique, the timing of your counterattack, the coordination with your crew, that's not standard commercial aviation training." Bob nodded quietly. "I had some additional experience that turned out to be relevant." "Military experience?" Agent Williams asked. 22 years Air Force, Bob confirmed. "Fighter pilot. I'd hoped I'd never need those skills in civilian aviation, but sometimes the past finds a way to be useful." The story made national news within hours. "Airline pilot foils hijacking. Using military training" became the headline, and Bob found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Interviews, commendations, and recognition from both the airline industry and military communities. But Bob handled the attention the same way he'd handled the hijacking, calmly, professionally, and with a focus on what mattered most. "I was just doing my job," he told reporters, "protecting my passengers and crew. That's what pilots are supposed to do." 3 months later, Bob received a letter from the Department of Defense thanking him for his service and offering him a position as an instructor at the Air Force Academy, teaching tactical aviation to the next generation of military pilots. Bob declined politely. He was happy flying commercial routes, he explained. The excitement of combat aviation was behind him, but he kept the letter in his flight case, next to his commercial pilot's license and the small American flag pin he'd started wearing on his uniform. Just in case anyone ever forgot that sometimes the quiet airline pilot in the left seat might be carrying skills that go far beyond civilian aviation. Some men retire from military service and never look back. Others find that military training doesn't retire. It just waits for the moment when people need protecting and civilian solutions aren't enough. Captain Bob Mitchell spent 15 years being exactly the airline pilot his passengers wanted him to be. But for 90 seconds at 25,000 feet, he was once again Colonel Robert Mitchell. And that made all the difference between a successful terrorist attack and 127 people going home safely to their families. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone who seemed ordinary, quiet, perhaps even unremarkable, only to discover they were carrying extraordinary skills and experiences that could change everything when it mattered most? Share their story in the comments. Tell us what city you're watching from. And if you think stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet heroes who walk among us, ready to use their training when lives hang in the balance. Because at Faces Behind Stories, we believe that heroism doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears an airline uniform and flies scheduled routes. But when danger strikes at 35,000 feet, there's no substitute for a warrior who knows how to fight. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.